Hi, I'm Sooper. Welcome to my Meltdown. Plato's Republic imparts a story that posits if a man could become invisible, he would go about among men with the powers of a god. Essentially, it argues that a person who suddenly has no consequences, and thus the power to do anything, will specifically commit acts of evil. In short, power corrupts. Which brings me to the 1897 H.G. Wells science fiction novel, The Invisible Man, its creation and journey through pop culture history, and how this relates to what power does to people.
It's about power.
I'm not going to pretend to be invisible for the entire video. That just seems like it would be unnecessary. You get the idea. H.G. Wells had already written several other successful works when he penned The Invisible Man, most notably The Time Machine and The Island of Dr. Moreau, and was pretty successful in his time. He said he derived the ideas for The Invisible Man from a novella he'd read called The Perils of Invisibility, and the aforementioned story from Plato's Republic. If you haven't read it, I'm going to give a brief synopsis of the plot of the original novel. There's a mysterious stranger named Griffin. He arrives in an English village. His entire body is covered in bandages, and he requests a room at the inn. He acts very suspicious.
Don't be suspicious. Don't be suspicious.
And paranoid, and eventually when the landlady tells him to pay his bill and leave, he accidentally reveals to her that the reason he's covered up is that he's invisible. She calls the police, who show up to arrest him, but he escapes by stripping completely so they can't see him. Shenanigans ensue. He gets a hobo named Marvel to help him, but Marvel goes to the cops, so he flees again, and eventually he comes upon a former colleague from medical school, Dr. Kemp. He explains to Kemp that he'd left medical school and found a formula to turn himself completely invisible. Afterward, he wandered about stealing food and such to survive, and was trying to find a way to supposedly reverse his condition. But it becomes clear to Kemp during their conversations that he's become mentally unstable and is no longer really trying to cure himself, because he finally has the power to do whatever he wants. And what he wants is his plan to have Kemp help him wander the countryside,
Burninating the countryside,
destroying things and killing people. Kemp then also goes to the cops. Griffin finds out, he turns on Kemp, but then the local village people converge on Griffin and beat him severely while he cries out for mercy, Richard Ramirez style. Kemp tries to give him medical attention, but his wounds are fatal. Griffin fades back to being visible as his life drains away. The novel ends with Marvel having found Griffin's notes and trying to figure out the formula to use himself, but he doesn't understand any of it, rendering the secrets of invisibility lost. Wells was still alive when Universal came asking to make a film version of his story, making it the only one among their monster films based on literature to have been approved by the author himself. He had script approval specifically in his contract for this. This is probably why there were a dozen scripts or treatments done before Wells approved the one that they used for the final product. Some of those treatments and scripts weren't even really remotely related to his novel, which is probably why they were scrapped. It was made in 1933 by Frankenstein director James Whale, and it is a pretty faithful adaptation of the novel, probably the most faithful to the source of all the Universal monster films. About the only major differences are that he kills Dr. Kemp in a staged car crash. They add a character who is his fiancée, Flora, to create a love triangle between her, Griffin, and Kemp. They change how Griffin is killed. Here he's shot after being trapped in a burning barn, sort of like John Wilkes Booth, but I think that's coincidence and not an intentional historical reference. And there being no Marvel character. I don't think the Marvel character really appears in almost any film adaptation that I have seen. Otherwise, the basic plot structure is pretty identical to the novel. The movie begins after the Universal Pictures card with a card that says NRA member with a logo of an eagle and we do our part under it, which is confusing for a younger viewer And then you look it up and it's the National Recovery Administration, which is an initiative set up by FDR in 1933, the year this movie was released. Without going too much into it, this was an attempt to help workers to set fair minimum wage and labor practices. Interestingly, it was set to expire in June of 1935 if it wasn't specifically renewed. But a month prior to that, the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously declared it an unconstitutional violation of the separation of powers. Some of its provisions popped back up in the Wagner Act later that year, and it had major effects on the power of labor unions and the New Deal that helped us recover from the Great Depression. But this video isn't about the history of labor unions or the New Deal or any of that, so all this is a long way of saying, no, it's not that NRA. The movie is pretty darkly comic and had some extremely advanced effects for the era. They came a long way from rubber bats and off-screen transformations in Dracula just 2 years earlier. Initially, Boris Karloff was supposed to play Griffin, but he had a contract dispute with Universal, and then Whale wanted Colin Clive, who had played Henry Frankenstein, but he had just come off of another film and wanted a rest. So they cast Claude Rains, who would later go on to play Captain Louis Renault in Casablanca and be part of one of my favorite jokes in cinema history.
I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on in here.
You're winning, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. Everybody out at once.
I can't imagine how Boris Karloff would have played this, but after living with this version for so many years, I think Rains does a really good job. And like Karloff and Frankenstein, he was not a well-known actor at the time in the US. This was his first starring role in a US film. But he's creepy and commanding and really manic when necessary, and it's almost all vocal work. He's only visible for about 20 seconds at the end of the movie, and other than that, you don't actually see his face at all. And it's especially amazing when you find out that Claude Rains grew up with a speech impediment and a stutter. And during World War I, when he was in the British military, he had been exposed to poison gas that temporarily paralyzed his vocal cords and left him partially blinded in one eye. Sadly, the blindness was permanent, as opposed to the effect on his voice. Griffin is very definitely not a sympathetic character. He's got a higher body count in his initial film than any of the other monsters in the Universal films, with over 100 dead. There's even a scene about 20 minutes in where he knocks over a baby carriage with the baby in it, just because. He didn't have to do that. Like, some of his actions have a specifically calculated plan, but here he's just causing chaos for its own sake. He later intentionally derails a train, which is why his body count is so high. This movie was a big commercial success for Universal, which is significant because this was, as I said earlier, deep into the Great Depression when nobody was doing well. Despite this, it would be another 7 years before Universal released a sequel in 1940. But when they did, they ended up releasing 2 sequels that year. In January was The Invisible Man Returns, starring Vincent Price as the title character. Again, you only see his face for about 20 seconds at the end of the movie, but it's his voice throughout. It was only his second horror film after being in Tower of London with Boris Karloff. Despite the title, he's actually a completely different character because Griffin died at the end of the first movie and stays dead throughout these, which is also sort of unusual for these. But in this, he's a man that's falsely accused of murder who begs Dr. Griffin's brother to give him the invisibility serum so he can avoid execution and find the real murderer. This and all the other sequels to this are new stories, most of them not really connected to each other. There's characters named Griffin in some of them, and there's familial connections, but none of them are really direct sequels to each other. Also, since the formula requires a person to remove all their clothing to be invisible, it means these are the only movies under the Hays Code to feature fully nude people in them. Just look at all these invisible naked people. In all seriousness, there is a scene about 30 minutes in where Dr. Griffin is experimenting, trying to reverse the invisibility formula, and he is testing it on a guinea pig who squeals and squirms before dying on screen. I don't know if the actual guinea pig died or not. I really couldn't find any information on that, but it was kind of messed up to see, and I'm surprised the Hays Code let that through. Censorship rules are weird and arbitrary. In December of that same year, they released The Invisible Woman. This one was very different in tone. It was a straight-up comedy, and they make sure you know it by having a pratfall down the stairs in the first 20 seconds. Unlike the previous film, it's not even loosely connected. There's no Griffin character at all. There's a totally different doctor. The invisibility is achieved by a machine instead of an injected formula, and it's temporary. For some reason, this version makes you want to drink a lot of alcohol because comedy, which also keeps the invisibility from wearing off because comedy, and also there are gangsters trying to steal the invisibility device, but they're inept gangsters because comedy. It's so blatantly comedy that one of the gangsters is Shemp Howard from the Three Stooges. In April of 1942, right after the US entered World War II, Universal put The Invisible Agent into production and completed filming the following month. Where the first film had been sci-fi horror, the second was a suspense murder mystery, the third was a slapstick comedy, and this fourth entry was more of an adventure movie with a heavy dose of war propaganda. With Jack Griffin's grandson, Frank Raymond, using an assumed name to avoid the association with his grandfather, using the formula for invisibility to spy on the Nazis. The movie literally has a smash cut from Frank saying there will never be a reason to justify using such a terrible weapon, to news clippings about Pearl Harbor, to him walking into a room of military men to offer them the formula as long as he is the only one that is able to use it. Honestly, it's an interesting left turn for the series, but certainly not the best of 1940s Hollywood war propaganda. That, of course, is Casablanca, though both movies do have Peter Lorre, which is always a bonus. And to be very clear, I don't mean propaganda as a negative thing. It's frequently used that way, but in this usage, I just mean that it's taking a very specific political position, which is Nazis are bad guys and should be resisted. Not a controversial statement, or at least it shouldn't be. Anyway, in 1944, they put out the final Invisible Man movie in the series proper, The Invisible Man's Revenge, in which another man named Griffin gets the invisibility formula, but this time he gets it from a different doctor. It's unclear how he's related to the previous Griffins, and also he's an escaped mental patient described in the film as a homicidal maniac who goes on a crime spree. And he becomes a maniac because he got hit in the head with a tree branch, so it's different. Now, he goes on this crime spree because he'd made a deal with some former friends over a diamond mine they found. They left him for dead, and then they try to screw him out of his share of the profit when he shows up after breaking out of the asylum. It's sort of implied that they hit him on the back of the head with the branch on purpose, but as I recall, the film leaves that a bit vague. The highlight of this entire movie is a German Shepherd who ultimately saves the day and kills Griffin. He is the goodest of boys and he is my favorite. The ending kind of glosses over the fact that they really did cheat Griffin out of $1 million, but he was a murderer, so I don't know, it evens out, I guess. There have been a variety of television series based on the character, but they're generally not great, and most have faded into obscurity over time. You might say they disappeared. There are a couple of episodes of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the TV series, that deal with invisibility. One in one of the first couple of seasons where there's just a character who appears in one episode and is a metaphor for how teenagers can sometimes feel invisible to their peers. And then there's one in season 6 where Buffy becomes invisible and hijinks ensue. I don't like season 6 very much. There have been a fair amount of songs called The Invisible Man. And that is the best one. Seriously, I love the bass groove, I love the guitars, I love everything about it. The music video is weird and goofy, but Queen was never afraid of being goofy. Also, you thought I wouldn't have a Funko Pop picture in this video, but you were wrong. In 1999, there was a comic series called The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which featured a number of characters generally from Victorian-era novels placed into a steampunk context who have to team up to save the world. This version features a take on Griffin that is one of the more monstrous and gruesome, as he's explicitly shown to rape several young girls, ends up betraying the League in their sequel book before himself being raped to death by Mr. Hyde. It's a well-regarded comic, but I kinda don't like it because of things like, well, that. There was a film adaptation of that comic series in 2003, which is hated by a lot of comic fans, and it's not exactly a perfect movie, but, and here is where I get hate mail, I like it more than the comic. I think it's fun and ridiculous. Comic purists seem to hate it because it's not as edgy, it adds some unnecessary characters, which it does, and it's generally not interested in the source's narrative, which seems to be latter Alan Moore's general, your heroes are all terrible, which he did better in Watchmen. The movie wasn't allowed to use the name Griffin due to copyright issues, so they just changed the character to a thief who had stolen the formula for invisibility and named him Rodney Skinner. He is not a rapist. I prefer this. I am very tired of rape as a plot device. Also, this movie was, to date, I think, the only movie that featured Captain Nemo that gets his ethnicity correctly. And that's a whole other topic for a book that is not this, that was Jules Verne, but whatever. Anyway, the movie didn't do great at the box office or with critics, and it resulted in both Sean Connery and director Stephen Norrington, who had directed Blade previously, retiring from filmmaking. And I just want to say, this caused Sean Connery to quit acting. He was fine with Zardoz and frigging Highlander 2, but this was too far. Look, buddy, I saw Highlander 2 in a theater in 1991, and I am still angry about it. In comparison to that, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen is a frigging masterpiece. Like, it's not a great movie still, but it's fun and harmless. But Highlander 2 is an embarrassment. How dare The year 2000's Hollow Man is sort of a remake of The Invisible Man, starring Kevin Bacon and Elizabeth Shue, though it shares no names or locations with the original. It does follow the concept of a scientist who slowly becomes mad after becoming invisible and engages in worse and worse behavior. It also uses rape as a plot point to show us how evil he's becoming. Can we stop? Most recently this year, 2020, there was another remake of The Invisible Man starring Elizabeth Moss. It keeps the name Griffin, but the plot is pretty different. It's reframed as a story about domestic abuse and stalking. And in this one, Griffin has special technology built into a suit that makes him invisible, so he can take it off at any time. I'm not big on that change because it removes the aspect where he's stuck the way he is, and that's part of what drives the psychological issues. It sort of drops the power metaphor in a sense, because the whole point is that absolute power is not something you can turn on and off like a light switch. But it did pretty well. They're talking about a sequel. They are talking about a spin-off movie with Elizabeth Banks. So this all started off with the idea that a person who becomes invisible will necessarily commit acts of evil. Power corrupts. But the way the adaptations have panned out on average, I think it more aptly demonstrates a different axiom, coined by journalist and author Robert Caro. All power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The more I've learned, the less I believe it. Power doesn't always corrupt. What power always does is reveal. When a guy gets into a position where he doesn't have to worry anymore, you see what he wanted to do all along. And that's not to say that power can't corrupt. It absolutely can, and it often does. But we need to watch the words of people in power and their actions. We need to hold them accountable, even if we think they'll do good things with that power. Power reveals, but it only works if we're paying attention. Some people get power and they want to derail trains or knock over baby carriages. Some want to use it to investigate a murder. Some may use it to stalk an ex or pull pranks on people. Maybe they want to use it for petty revenge against the boss who fired them. Maybe they want to use it to fight Nazis. Power reveals. And I think that's important to think about. when we give power to someone, either in our personal lives or in large-scale national elections, because people in power will reveal who they are when they think there are no consequences. And we're seeing it right now in ways too numerous for me to point out. Because, to use another axiom, when you put garbage in, you get garbage out. Sorry for that being a heavy end, but if you want to argue with me about the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, you can do it in the comments below. If you want to argue about politics, don't. Sir, this is an Arby's drive-thru. If you want more of this nonsense, like and subscribe to my channel. And as per usual, thanks for coming to my meltdown.